How does a nuclear submarine stay submerged for months at a time? Where do they get the air? And did you know that US submariners actually eat pretty much as well as the president? Now look, submarines are cool. That's an opinion that most, if not all, regular viewers of this channel probably share. And yet there is so much us lowly civilians just don't know about them. We can't check on a nuclear submarine's flight plan like you might your mother's budget Wizz Air flight. So on today's episode of Sideprojects, we're going to peel back the veil of military mystery and dive into the daily life of the men and women aboard these mysterious underwater death tubes and discuss 5 surprising things about life on a submarine. First, let's start small. I mean, really small. Submersibles, like the Deep Sea Challenger of James Cameron fame, are visually distinct in comparison to a nuclear submarine by quite a way. The biggest difference is the size. But on top of this, submersibles generally have windows or some kind of viewing port, while for the most part, submarines tend to avoid the windowed look altogether. But the keen on subs among you might be asking, well, Simon, don't Russian subs like the Foxtrot and the Yasen include windows on their conning tower? How does the immense pressure of almost 45 atmospheres at the Yasen's test depth of 1,475 feet not shatter the glass, drowning everybody inside? And well, why go through all the effort of having windows on the conning tower in the first place? Well, you see, when leaving port from sunny Pearl Harbor, having a lookout pop their head out and scout around, not really a big deal. But do that in the sub-zero temperatures that Russian subs leave port in, and you might want some windows. It's cold outside. But these windows are actually still relatively thin flat panels made of polyacrylic plastic. They can stop bullets, but they absolutely won't stop the catastrophic hull failure like the concave windows that we see on submersibles. So rather than fighting all of that pressure with domed ultra-thick windows, the simple solution is to just seal off the conning tower during a dive and flood it with outside seawater, equalizing the pressure between the inside and the outside of the glass. I mean, work smarter, not harder. That's really clever. Okay, everybody, let's interrupt today's video and talk a little bit about skincare. Not exactly what you'd expect from me. I'm not a skincare fanatic. I'm not a beauty influencer. I give you facts, but I'll give you a fact. FOREO's products are exceptional stuff. For example, this is the UFO 3. This little gadget gives a level of hydration that is unprecedented in just a minute. And then you've got the Lunar 4, which, you can tell from how it looks is a face cleaning device. Then you've got the one this one I use every day actually. This is the Bear. It's a microcurrent device and it basically helps get rid of any wrinkles. And as a man who is rapidly approaching and definitely has not entered middle age, this is a nice one. Plus, a little bit more anti-aging with the FAQ 202 LED mask. It's like professional grade skin care therapy at home. Honestly, it's just really fantastic stuff. And look, FOREO rarely goes on sale, but Black Friday is around the corner and they are offering their biggest sale of the year. Right now, you can get up to 50% off across their site with my code SIDEP10. And using that code, you'll get an extra 10% off on top, which is a truly once-a-year deal. If there's ever been a time to get some FOREO for you or a loved one, I mean, Christmas will be coming up after, Black Friday, won't it? So think about that. It's a fantastic gift for you or someone special. Thank you to FOREO for sponsoring, and now back to today's video. So a submarine doesn't have any windows, but even if it did, no light is going to make the trip 1,400 feet below the surface of the ocean anyway. So submarines rely on electrical lighting supplied by its onboard diesel generator or nuclear reactor. However, if you've seen any submarine media, you might have noticed that during mission operations, the lights are typically kept relatively dim, or weirder, they're turned red. This is referred to as rigging for red, and is done because the color red has a longer wavelength than other colors on the visible spectrum. So by rigging for red, submariners can preserve their night vision while at periscope depth. Rigging for black, on the other hand, is when all lights that could be seen from the conning tower or periscope are turned off, both to help with night vision and to make the sub less visible against the ocean at night. But not only are submarines dark, they're also cramped. Former US Navy submariner Stephen France says, "There are very few spaces on a submarine where you could extend your arms and spin around without hitting anything. It is very easy to hit your head on doorways, pipes, etc. You get used to it, or you go crazy." This is somewhat surprising when you consider that a vessel like the Los Angeles-class fast attack submarine is 362 feet long, and that seems like more than enough space to fit 140 officers and enlisted personnel on board. But when you take into consideration that the majority of that space is taken up by engines, nuclear reactors, life support, sonar, and enough firepower to alter the course of human history, it's surprising these beasts have enough space to fit any people at all. Vanity Fair reporter Adam Saralski shares a similar yet contrasting sentiment, quote, "My first impressions were predictable. The ship seemed cramped with narrow passageways. I was surprised, though, that the boomer's 4 decks with 14-foot ceilings also made it seem cavernous, even airy in certain spots." Unfortunately, as you might expect, sharing your very limited personal space with 140 other people compounds the typical issues common with human biology. Stephen Franz continues, "If there were more crew members than bunks, you had to share the bunk. This was called hot bunking because when you got in your bunk, it was still warm from the last guy. The atmosphere is closed, although they ventilate the sub periodically. All the smells are recirculated. Galley, diesel, body odor, cigarette smoke, paint, cleaning supplies, etc. It's pretty bad for a week, but then you don't notice it." End quote. With crews as large as 175 personnel on something like the Typhoon class, no matter how much oxygen you bring on board, you are going to run out pretty quickly. This means that for a sub to stay in operation, it needs to create its own oxygen. This is done through electrolysis, not unlike what you'd have done in high school science class. By using purified water and potassium hydroxide as an electrolyte, it is hooked up to electricity from the nuclear reactor, and the water is broken down into oxygen and hydrogen. But you might be thinking, well, a submarine is surrounded by water. Why would they specifically need purified water and potassium hydroxide when seawater has oxygen and hydrogen in abundance? Well, unfortunately, among that oxygen and hydrogen, we also find salt or sodium chloride. So, when using electrolysis on seawater, you don't make hydrogen and oxygen, but rather you make hydrogen and chlorine, which is not brilliant for breathing. However, there is another even more confounding process used to create oxygen on submarines, and at first it seemed completely counterintuitive. In a situation where they cannot create oxygen via electrolysis, or the sub needs an extra top-up of oxygen, they will use what is called a chlorate candle or oxygen candle. Now, unlike a regular candle you'd find in your home that uses an accelerant like wax to burn oxygen in the air, a chlorate candle contains sodium chlorate and iron. When lit, the iron combines with the oxygen in the air to become iron oxide. The extreme heat from the burning of the iron oxide then frees the oxygen from the sodium chlorate, thus creating even more oxygen than the initial iron oxide reaction. This solution is not only used on submarines, as oxygen candles are a common solution in space stations too. However, they're not without risk. Back in 1997, a fire broke out in the Cavant module of the Mir space station due to an incident involving an oxygen candle. Now look, most people probably pretty nervous about setting a fire on a submarine, especially a self-oxygenating fire like we see with the chlorate candle. So it may not be surprising that fire flood and any number of casualty drills are practiced over and over again on a submarine. According to Captain Castellano of the USS Toledo, quote, "Every person on board has to be able to stop flooding, put fires out, or respond to casualty. So no matter your job on a submarine, you have to know how to fight a casualty. Everyone here does, from the cook to the captain." End quote. The level of expertise required from each and every member of the crew in the instance of a casualty taking place on board the sub means a significant amount of time must be dedicated to drilling these casualty procedures. France mentions that, quote, "You drill constantly, at least we did. Perhaps it was to avoid boredom, but we ran emergency drills daily, sometimes multiple watches. You get quite good at handling multiple simultaneous emergencies. Although they were drills, on a sub, once the drill starts, it is pretty much the real thing. If they scram the reactor, shut it down, you really don't have power and you aren't pretending. We never said this is a drill, except for weapon launchers." The quote ends. The level of self-reliance, as well as reliance on your fellow crewmates, results in a co-worker situation that very few of us truly experience, or perhaps ever want to experience. France continues, "In a very real sense, your life depends on everyone else doing their job correctly. If they didn't, it could jeopardize the ship. This produced not only teamwork and camaraderie, but also hatred and grudges." Now, as we mentioned earlier, a submarine could create its own oxygen, so the limiting factor in how long a submarine can stay on a mission is not based on fresh air, but rather fresh food. When in port, a nuclear submarine like the Los Angeles class will stock up on a minimum of 30 days of food. However, they can stock up for much longer missions, but despite shelf life being the major limitation to mission's length, the US Navy's submarine fleet has one very powerful weapon in its arsenal, and that is really excellent food. The reason for this? Good food equals good morale. But when you find out that the Navy not only feeds submariners, but also runs the dining room of the White House, this becomes less surprising. So while the Commander-in-Chief is dining on the best of the best, so too is a torpedo technician somewhere deep beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. France corroborated this, saying, "The food was great. They compensate us for harsh living conditions with lots of great food. Once we had Chateaubriand, steak was fairly common. They had soft ice cream available 24/7. The love of submarine food seems to be ubiquitous, with Suralski saying, "At one point on the trip, I found myself marveling over, of all things, a biscuit. Not only was it gluten-free, it was delicious. For one lunch, we had a Mexican spread. Even at sea, they called it Taco Tuesday. We dined on oxtail, salmon, and winter vegetables, served on proper Navy china." And while you would generally expect frozen, ready-made meals, most food on board a sub is made from scratch. This includes things like bread and pizza, because storing flour and yeast is a lot easier than storing months' worth of bread. Great food is all well and good, but let's bring it all back to why these objectively terrifying machines are lurking in our oceans in the first place. And that's bombs. Or as the government would spin it, deterrence. According to Suralski, the Department of Defense relies on a triad: intercontinental ballistic missiles, long-range bombers, and submarines. The latter are considered the triad's least vulnerable leg and carry 70% of all deployed nuclear warheads in the inventory. End quote. Describing the power of the USS Wyoming and a higher-class ballistic missile submarine, he said, "A multi-million-dollar behemoth that is slightly longer than the Washington Monument is tall, the ship can carry up to 160 thermonuclear warheads, roughly the same firepower as India, a country that has been stockpiling nuclear arms for half a century." End quote. From torpedo tubes to missile bays and the overwhelming weapon stockpiles aboard modern nuclear submarines, it is impossible to ignore that every part of this machine was built to house these brutal weapons. From red lighting to crammed living quarters, from the oxygen candles and even the great food and, of course, the crew. Everything on a nuclear submarine is there in service of the weapons on board. So in marveling over these incredible feats of science, engineering, and human tenacity, we can't forget what put them in the first place: war. And that is a thought that cannot be very far from your mind when living deep below the surface of the ocean, ready to push the big red button when given the command.